Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Airlock, and this is another talk on Chinese philosophy and one of the most important philosophers in all of human history, if we're counting up followings, Confucius. And we are going to give a couple of talks here on Confucius and then Mencius, Sunsa, not Sunsa, Hasunsa, with a tiny bit of an H. I try to fake it again and make it, which is X, Unzi, is and then Neo-Confucianism, Zhu Si and Wang Yangming. So we're going to be covering a bunch of Confucians, and this is the starting first and foremost Confucian. Guess who? Confucius, Grand Master Kong, Kong Fu Tzu. Now, most Chinese philosophers have Zi is the current pinyin spelling. It was Tzu. Now it is Zi. That has been since the 80s. So if you see 60s and 70s paperbacks, those are the Tzu. But Confucius's name is Latinized as Confucius, as Mencius is, because Jesuits have actually been into both Confucius and Mencius and how Jesus they are or are not since the 1600s. Europeans have known. I gave a talk on Leibniz. He is a cinephile and one guy into the yin-yang system as a German and a early inventor of the mechanized abacus known as the computer, which is somewhat inspired by the Chinese yin-yang system. I've already given a talk or two about this or that about that. So see those with Leibniz and then the yin-yang talks if you want to hear a bunch about all of that together and a bunch of weird, interesting things about Leibniz, who was an interesting German in the 1600s. That Grandmaster Kong, Confucius, has definitely dazzled the world in being very much, kind of in ways and in ways not, the Chinese Jesus, and has been a major philosopher, religious founder, and founder of Chinese culture. And right now, of course, without pushing any buttons more so, we do live in times where clearly, in order to understand Chinese culture, you should understand plenty, Confucius. You should also know, of course, China is currently communist, which means they are actively, currently, keeping Confucius and Taoism alive and Chinese Buddhism and keeping these things alive as cultural traditions, but technically, without judging or going back and forth about it, communist China is not entirely into religion, being communist. And again, we'll leave all of that for talks actually in the wings because we are going to get along here to Confucius. All I mean by all of that, of course, is knowing Confucius and also knowing that given that the Western world and China and Japan and Korea, these are all power brokers in the modern world. So if you want to be a worldly person, a cosmopolitan, a la Diogenes of ancient Greece, you should probably know a bit about Confucius. He is an amazing thinker. He does strike me a bit as Republican Dad. I am a bit lefty-lefty. You may not have noticed that. And by that, I mean he very much reminds me of Kung Fu Hustle, given how central, and in communist China, very much preserving Confucian culture is a thing. Doing Confucian scholarship on Confucius in universities is very seriously a thing. And he reminds me very much of Kung Fu Hustle, gotta say, where the dad, that the mother says, the hero guy, he resembles our son, towards the end of the movie, and the dad chimes in immediately, at least in the English subtitles, is like, if he studies very hard, he could be a doctor or a lawyer. Is that he is definitely, Confucius wants you to study hard, take your exams, be a good student, get a good job, work hard. He definitely is Republican Dad, Well, son, are you winning, son, with the pipe? So he definitely is that. That is not entirely who I am, but much love and all types of people, and takes all types at the watering hole. But Confucius is also an incredibly admirable thinker, not only for all of the ways I'm not, but, which we all admire, of course. What he is one of the most impressive ethicists of all time, because as I just gave a talk about, and I love getting into psychology and Confucius, and what is the general human mind, or are there general pragmatic ethics at all? If there are great geniuses in the world who have been great ethicists and great philosophers, and Confucius is both, and political and ethical as well as, and that's not removable from his thought entirely, as well as then is a philosopher thinking about truth, meaning, and all of it. That as he is talking through all of it, Confucius is one of the most important thinkers for something like ye olde golden rule, which means there is something basic to human psychology where reversing your perspective is very good and nourishing for people. You can definitely feel that as central. Confucius says the one string running through the strand of his thinking, the one string throughout the whole, the one thread sewn throughout the whole, is compassion/humanity. The word ren, as best as is translated, something like love, and by love, the essence of humaneness. Of course, again, as I love to say, bears can't really be inhumane, only humans can be inhumane, oh so sadly, but that actually is Confucianism. How humane and loving and true can we be, because that is what it is to be human, and how can we be this above the birds and the beasts? And in that, Confucius is very Aristotle, not let's go be Taoists and go hang out a la Diogenes as a bum in the marketplace, or with the Taoists hanging out with nature, where you have the Sleeping Beauty, squirrels and birds all up your arms, and then Homer Simpson is in the shower like, guys, can you give me 5 minutes, after being all enlightened? Peace be with all the animals up my arms. It's like, Confucius wants you to study hard, make distinction. He is very wonderful and complex about don't just succeed. He is quite brilliant in this. You don't want to just succeed and get ahead, because as we all know, that can be quite evil. But what he does believe is you should study hard, you should work hard, no matter how much you succeed, because that is being truly loving and being a true human being for your community and for the world, and for your family in most traditional ways. For many people nowadays, even plenty of right-leaning people would see Confucius as quite traditional of ancient China. But in spite of that, especially with left and right as they are, and all of these things, Confucius is not only a very good thinker to examine for politics and ethics, he is one of the world's great geniuses, and it is very important to understand how brilliant he really is at reversing perspective while also towing the conservative line. I very much do like the kind of Hegelian backs and forths of, you do find, as Hegel says, the right wing kind of likes black and white, the left wing kind of likes shades of gray. That gets complicated amongst branchings of branchings of branchings, but Confucius is very good at being Republican dad, but also being very into reversal of perspective, which you often find in things like Taoism and Heraclitus, being far more, overturn kind of the ways of things, more what some might call progressive, but that's not it's not really from one thing to another. More thinkers who are more skeptical of the ancient world would have seen because that's original nature, or more like being part of hippie nature, man. Not really progressing to the next stage of technology, which is kind of what progressive almost, sort of, at least, okay, everything goes somewhere as action and intentional. But again, progressive kind of means we're going to get over something or go further, whereas a lot of course, this stuff would be more hippie. No, like, let's get back to, kind of that sort of thing. For the Taoists, not for Confucius. He specifically says, don't melt back into nature and just be chill. He specifically says stand out and work hard. So that, as an opening little rant, the name, to get back to the steady material here, the name Confucius was translated into Latin by Jesuit Catholic missionaries who sailed to China from Italy during the Italian Renaissance in the 1500s, who were surprised to find that the central philosopher of China said things very similar to things Jesus said, such as treat people the way you want to be treated. It's as with a lot of the stuff, I do love how much the human mind is the human mind, possibly for well over 100, 200,000 years. So treat people the way you want to be treated is quite tribal, it's quite city-state, it's quite everyday, and I get to teach people ancient thought, and I get to teach people ancient Chinese thinkers, and of course, plenty of them American has said, this is so relevant today. It's like, how did that all happen all at once? I'm amazed. So, still with the same brainstem, hands, lots of research suggests cultures do lie, cheat, and steal, and people do on a range of ways, not all equally, but on a range of ways all across the world. So, people are people, at least. Let's say that and leave the politics again until later in this lecture. So it would be nice if times of peace and prosperity are good for thought. I just gave a talk where I gave a little bit of this in the notes, where essentially during the Warring States period, which is also the golden age of Chinese thought, please see that talk, which I have put in the playlist for East Asian and Chinese thought ahead of this. And this will also be in the ethics as well for the fall. Found out, and that's good. So human beings rethink problems when they are faced with problems, and what you actually find is people are not simply let's abandon the old in times of strife. What they do is in times of strife and decay or collapse, or whether the decay kind of implies good or bad, In mix-up, people turn to new and complex and different answers, and then they often then justify it with the next dogma, with the next empire, with the next paradigm. We're all more used to that kind of language post a lot of the philosophy and the steps I like to teach people. That when people are faced with terrible times, all that's, of course, informing what I'm telling you, that people form and reform culture. We see this in various ways. Of course, they do, I love to point out, remain very human, such that Confucius means a lot to me and hopefully does to you. But at the same time, people form and reform cultures in lots of ways. So what you see is philosophy happens during the Warring States period of China, like in Athens and other places, when things are somewhat collapsing and then collapse and then are reformed, and these are new periods of thought, religion, art, and philosophy all together. So I mentioned, again, the Zhou collapsed into the spring and autumn, which collapsed further into the Warring States, which was then followed by the long prosperous first Qin and then the brief Qin and then prosperous Han dynasty. Now Lao Tzu and Confucius lived from 551 to 479, were the two great Chinese philosophers, the founders of Taoism and Confucianism, and they lived during the declining period. Their immediate followers, Mencius, Sun Tzu, Liezi, and Chuang-Tzu, lived during the Warring States period. So you have the founders are during the period before the Warring States period, the spring and autumn period, as things are further falling apart from the Zhou. Then they fell further from that period into chaos and warring states. And as that was happening, the second most important Confucians and Mencius and Sun Tzu, not the war strategist Sun Tzu. Again, those are confusingly, similar names. That's X starting and S starting names. And other than that, they're spelled identically in English. Sound very similar, especially when I'm saying it at all. So then you also have Liezi and Chuang-Tzu are the second and third Taoists. They're all during the Golden Age. So actually, the main guys are just before the Golden Age, Warring States, gang warfare period. And then you have the founding secondary thinkers who aren't yet establishing Confucianism entirely, are in the time of Confucianism and Taoism getting established. And then after them, they become the founding people who help the founding patriarchs, Lao Tzu for Taoism and Confucius for Confucianism. Then with two guys apiece in the golden age of the Warring States period. Hey, buddy. I have a golden period of some cats. Hey, buddy. He was trying to get up on the thing, and I'll let him go. I have to, sadly, shut the window. They love the window open because they love the air whenever I open the outside, of course. They do, thankfully, because I'm kept them indoors for a year. They do want to hang out indoors around here, which is nice. I don't want to lose them. But at the same time, I have to close the window for the noise, which limits their air and getting to hear and see things outside. So yes, I feel sad and conflicted. It's a bit of a Warring States period. So what I am telling you, basically, is that for the purposes of Confucius, what we're studying, Confucius is before the Warring States golden period I just talked about, then Mencius and Sun Tzu, who's also a Confucian, also a legalist and a Confucian, that those guys are during the Warring States period that the video I made the other day just talked about. So after about 100 years before the birth of Confucius, the political philosopher Guangzhong led the state of Qi and neighboring states such as Lu to several decades of relative stability as prime minister in 685 BCE. That is about 700 years, again, before Jesus. In China, there is a major political philosopher who is then admired. And this is a guy we know, as far as I know, very little about, but then Confucius is one of the people who lays down the classics, and we know a bunch about him. Again, with much, often I bring up, in the humanities, when the texts are where is everything. Like when there's a fragment of a text here or there is the first time you hear about anything is the concrete. Of course, a picture would be nice, but how do we know what a picture is of whom if it's not labeled or there aren't words around there? Writing definitely brings any record of anything such that that would affect what I or the finest scholars of China, who will always know far, far more about this than I ever will, could tell you about it because we only have fragments of text, and it is very modern scholarship here and in China to be very careful about what you say beyond the text. I, thankfully, am kind of popularizing all of this so I can make terrible jokes and kind of tell you overall the flight pattern here is. But we can't say much about Guangzhong because there isn't much written down about him, simply because what writing was did not survive much, and there wasn't as much writing in 700 BCE. So there were fewer scribes and writers and people in authorship, just period, all over the world. So yeah, all of that. Again, there's writing in China safely. There has been for thousands of years at that point. Also writing in Sumer, Egypt, etc. So Confucius was born in Lu, where Guangzhong was praised as a wise philosopher king whose compassionate ways led to peace and harmony. Confucius's family were nobles who had education, but lower-level aristocrats who had fallen on hard times, made worse when Confucius's father, a soldier, died in combat when Confucius was very young. Once again, warring states periods, also like Bambi, sadly, I did watch that movie traumatizingly in a theater as a very tiny child, is Godzilla versus Bambi. Philosophers seem to always lose a parent or being warring states period or have lives shaken up a bunch. I mean, everybody does. How many biographies would you find that don't have lives shaken up? But philosophers particularly seek what is stable beyond the world in many ways, and it oftentimes apparent a warring period shake-up to make up. It's like that is very common, and I mentioned that. That's Descartes, that's Plato, a couple other people you've heard of, Nietzsche. I'm going to do more Nietzsche soon, and actually he weirdly fits with Confucius, and then they just part ways and don't fit at all in many ways. Like a lot of interesting combos of thinkers, you hold up both to the light. It's weird how people are and aren't in these thinkers. Confucius is and isn't Nietzsche in a lot of weird, cool ways, which is why I like the guy, in spite of the fact he is very much, unlike Nietzsche, Republican dad. Confucius is Republican dad. Nietzsche is angry libertarian writing letters to the editor, about how he thinks everything is fascism. But that's not important right now, kids, nor how much that's libertarians today. So, by the age of 15, Confucius had decided to study the classics, which were better kept and studied in Lu than in other states. Legend has it that in his 20s, Confucius opened a school for children and would charge what he thought the parents could afford. When the rich complained, he replied that they were welcome to take their children to any teacher they like. Take your stupid kid out of here, that's fine. Don't let the door, the screen slide and hit you and then clip the side of your foot. And he would, on the way out. And he would keep his prices as they were. By 30, he was studying ancient government in the court of Lu with other scholars and had a position as overseer of the public fields and granary. There is a map, and you can look up the map of his travels all around China, and thankfully we have Creative Commons and common shared images again, so I can rely on the kindness of strangers as I do on this trolley cart of death. So, and life and rebirth and everything. Yes, all wound up together. So, back to the single thread of Confucius, tying up this talk. After fleeing to Qi during a time of unrest, refusing to serve a tyrant. This is very Plato and Greek philosophy. There's tyrants, there's democracy, there's not. What's this? How do you rule the state when things are collapsing? Lots of common, and people have written about this stuff in India and China and Egypt, etc., that you see these patterns since the 70s especially, is that you do see these similarities. Although I do think we should still teach philosophy students a lot more global philosophy. I don't think we do enough, and haven't since the 70s, oddly. But people have written about the similarities here since the 70s, and I believe in teaching all that more. That Confucius is dealing with tyrants, whether or not to serve this or that court, whether or not to serve a good or bad king or not, and how good or that bad is that to the people or not, is very concerned with all of that, and that's central to Chinese culture and thought. This is also, I do believe in mentioning, having Asian American friends from a young age and other things. It is a lot more complicated than Western thought is into democracy and Eastern thought is into tyranny and authority. That is how it would certainly also be presented now. I will just lovingly and humbly say, without getting into political issues or acting like lives aren't, at stake all over the world in many, many stacked ways. It really isn't that the West just stands for freedom and the East just stands for authority or bow to the leader, because you can see that so much in Confucius wrestling with things, and that's so central to Chinese thought, that you would not see in China a lack of like awareness about what tyranny is as much as you or I think whatever about China, and I will just leave that right there because I don't honestly want to take sides about the current government of China right here, and I will say that happily. It is the taco truck, which ends up pleasantly interrupting. And there it goes. That is again for the high school students and construction workers outside, and that has been going on for years. So again, that pleasantly does drift through the window panes. But onward from Kant. So let's not be entirely categorical. So what you have here is that Confucius is wrestling a lot with whether or not to join an authoritarian regime or not. He, in many ways, is wrestling with the sorts of issues that Western and Eastern cultures wrestle with. Just take that for what you will, and I'm not trying to convince you that this or that place is better or bad or good, the good, bad, and the ugly, and all of that. Yeah, because the world's very global, etc. So, with all that, though, and teaching people Chinese culture, certainly Confucius, like Plato and others, are very old school into authority, and also are wrestling with the issues as you and I do in many ways and can teach us a lot, and there's later and later thinkers. Keep having them. How does that keep happening? At 70, they all keep having ideas that this is not perfect somehow. And Confucius says, never met a perfect person, don't expect to. At 70, Confucius left Lu and traveled with many followers from kingdom to kingdom, attempting to teach more rulers his ways and bring the warring states back into the lost peace and unity of the Zhou dynasty, which the spring and autumn and then warring periods idealize, as did the Qi in gathering China as if they were the Zhou, but they were a bit radically different. And then the Han come along, they say we have the mandate of heaven, unlike the Qi who lost it. And by the way, that makes us like the Zhou, and we can hold on to China. That is very much how the Han presented themselves, and in doing so, they are picking up Confucianism and on the side Taoism, supporting this with patronage, and this is where Confucianism gets to us from, is from the Han dynasty, patronizing Confucius, and saying this very much gives us the mandate of heaven. Confucius likes the mandate of heaven. He wants all this to be in order. Well, guess what? We definitely are philosophical and awesome like that. As philosophy has been carried by empires, religions, in many, many ways, used for probably good and bad, all of this. And in fact, of course, in communist China, it is certainly in vogue to think that Confucianism has been used for good and bad. In communist China, I certainly can say Confucius is both openly praised as a great figure of democracy, which communism praises itself as being, whether or not you or I think this or that and not about it. And I'm leaving that right there. And also praised as this great founder of humanity and the philosophy. He's also derided as a feudalist, somebody who kept China back, who's just complicit with the power system. The Chinese have talked freely about this for thousands of years, and in communist China, it is safe to argue both. I would say, it is my opinion, I have not yet been to China. I do want to go. This isn't the year, to go anywhere, really, as an American, certainly, yeesh, but someday I will go to China, travel around, see the ancient sites. I certainly will, or I want to. I hope to sometime in this life, because I love to teach about this stuff. So in that, to bring back to the point, certainly in the establishment of Chinese classical culture during the Han, from the warring states, and then that through with the brief Qi turning to the Han, you have the establishment of Confucius saying the Han, like the Zhou, although Confucius was into the Zhou and didn't know who the Han were because he was safely dead at that point, as was Mencius and Sun Tzu, as they were all canonized in the Han by Confucians at that point in that empire, very much as philosophy and religion forms in times of holding empire, that Confucius is, in a certain sense, being used to say by the Zhou, we have the mandate of heaven. The heavens speak for us as they did, as God speaks for Louis XVI through the Catholic Church in the 1700s, in France all the way up through then, and all across human cultures, plenty forming kind of, even as they stay polytheistic, somewhat monotheistic empire, king, emperor at the center in China, India, and elsewhere. You have sort of central fatherish God, gods, spirits, saints, etc., and you have the Zhou with all of the Han with all of this saying, and Confucius and all of that make us very, very much like the zoo, which means we're trying to get the old empire back together, trying to get the band back together. We're trying to be the empire. And they were, in fact, for 400 years. This 200, this and that side is zero mark. So, yeah, not 0 year, 0 mark. But yeah, it would be, didn't call it that at the time, most folks, I suppose. So, what you would have here is that Confucius has a very famous quote, which is, at 15, I set my mind upon learning. At 30, I took my stand. At 40, I had no doubts. At 50, I knew the will of heaven. At 60, my ear was attuned. At 70, I follow all the desires of my heart without breaking any rule. That is Analects 2:1. And just like the Bible, 2:1, as far as book 2, not verse, it would be Analect. It's book 2 of the Analects, and then the single aphorism number 1. That is like standardized, like Luke, 15:34. It is basically standardized such that you could refer to like Analects 3:4, and it's like 3 point is typical in like brackets. I put it into cite in the material. When I do have that there, like 2 in bracket 2.1 end bracket, meaning that's in Analects 2.1. That's book 2 of the Analects and first chunk, separate little chunk, piece of text. Also sometimes called aphorisms, but that also sort of aphorism somewhat implies it's kind of not fictitious, but almost not as historical or as historical a record, I would say, although, that goes back and forth, honestly. Situations historically recorded by Confucius' students about Confucius and what he said and what he did in his interactions. So let's get along here. That we have had, let's see. So let's start getting here into Confucius and compassion, and then I will end this talk and then continue the talk in another chunk, and talk about more complex lessons of compassion and inner and outer intent in another talk. So before we end this talk, though, we are going to talk a little bit here about what I started with ranting about how Confucius believes in compassion and reversal of perspective in order to understand self and other, and he is one of the great talented philosophers and ethicists of the world. So Confucius said that if we only had a single word to guide us in life, it should be reciprocity, which is actually a whole lot of syllables. I try to limit syllables, actually pare them down as much as possible on purpose. I think it's better for people, I will unashamedly say. So reciprocity is actually a very complicated word for Ren, compassion, which is just a single syllable here, of course. In the Chinese, reciprocity is like a very complicated word for something which I have to say I am continuously critical of academic stuff making Ren, which is compassion, reciprocity. If you get what I mean here, it's like, but love would be more like Ren, and then it's like, but of course by love here, exactly, it's like, if Ren means many things, yeah, and love means many things, and that actually, but what kind of love, or what kind of humanity, or reciprocity? So honestly, making it a single syllable, it's like, this kind of thing, it does bug me a tiny bit, but reciprocity, compassion, love is something like Ren. It was spelled actually confusingly in the old Wade Giles Jen and pronounce it like an R, Y, and now it is changed to Ren. So even if I don't like chi being spelled Qi, Ren is actually more supposed to be the pronunciation of it. And yes. By the way, actually, this is an interesting place to point out, just something odd, as a person who does believe in anti-racism and just kind of pushing all around with culture. You will sometimes find East Asian accents joked around about in jokes. I won't make many of them now. There's one about supplies I heard as a kid. And those jokes oftentimes actually turn on confusion, which you find. I may as well mention lovingly. In Japanese, there aren't R's and L's. In Japan, they do not pronounce L. They would pronounce L's as R's. If you want to fake a Japanese accent lovingly, please do, or don't, yeesh. You would not pronounce L and you would pronounce it as R, as in you would pronounce something like rovingly, like you would not pronounce lovingly. But in Chinese, they do have both L and R. So there are jokes like where when I was a kid, again, I'm not going to tell the whole joke. There's a joke in America where there's like a Chinese guy, and then instead of surprise, he says supplies, which actually in a weird way is almost anti what the Japanese, it's of course, whether or not it's anti-Asian, and I'm not telling the whole joke, and I actually am cautious and think that culturally people are cautious about making fun of Asian accents, and I'm glad they are, and I am, because in many ways, weirdly enough, just to say it simply, it's actually like Black and Latinx people are actually perceived as American psychologically and Christian kind of, whereas East Asians often are perceived as different religion. I teach people Confucius and Buddhism, so in a certain sense, it's perceived differently. Let me just leave that there. I'm relying on work of others to suggest work like that, or that that's what's going on here. But I'll return here to the point I'm oddly ranting about. With Ren and pronouncing that, there are jokes you find where people mock, there's jokes about Chinese people not being able to pronounce R, like supplies. That's actually wrong. It would be Japanese folks would pronounce L as R and don't have L. So actually you would never be in a situation where either Chinese or Japanese people would ever say supplies instead of surprise, because the Chinese person would have R to say surprise and the Japanese person could not pronounce L. So they would actually, if you said supplies, they would say surprise. Funny enough. I just have to say that. That occurred to me, the other day like an idiot, because I think about all these things too much. You've seen too much. That is my weirdly uncomfortable anti-Asian, and my anti-racism, pro-Asian, not anti-Asian. That is my anti-Asian racism. That's what I want to tell you it is. Yes, that's right. Of course. So given all of that, I know enough as a white guy to actually so fly, as I actually know, as I am up here in the sky being an idiot through the airwaves, that, yeah, funny enough, that is actually sort of Americans, I think, encountering Japanese language and culture and then somewhat misprojecting that in popular jokes onto Chinese folks, is my suspicion. That said, let's get back to Confucius and compassion again. So, with Confucius and compassion, love, Ren, Confucius says that is the one thread running throughout my jokes, let's hope, and throughout these lectures, and Confucius's teaching. That is 4:15 of the Analects. Reciprocity being the one guide of life is 1524. I'm going to stop mentioning these numbers now and not keep mentioning them in this talk. Please look at my website if you want the citings. I am going to blow through these teachings as if I'm just sort of giving my perspective some of this times. Please check my notes, because a lot of this I'm backing up what Confucius is saying and arguing as Confucius, given how I'm citing it in the notes. So just be aware of that. And be more aware I'm obviously more interested in joking than citing my sources. That would be wise as well. So compassion for Confucius is both seeing perspectives of others and feeling for them. The ability and capacity to engage in reciprocity, love, humanity, perspective, something a lot, thought, argument, overall, how all of that is intertwined. I like Wittgenstein. Compassion is sometimes identified with and distinguished from wisdom in human culture. Socrates very much identifies love with wisdom and thinks they're one and the same. Feeling for others and love for others is very much a part of being wise. You get that a lot in Confucius. Wittgenstein, actually, I do love Wittgenstein as my favorite. He does say at one point, and I remember a friend not enjoying this at all as a comment, is wisdom is cold. And you can actually imagine wisdom way up on the hill looking at people could be cold and calculating, but also could be loving and stupid, a la Hume hopes philosophy will be. You definitely have Socrates like Confucius. Wisdom, or anything like wisdom and philosophy, is very much bound up with openness and loving others and loving life and perspective. If you don't do that, you're closed up and not wise, according to Socrates and Confucius, but not necessarily all other thinkers. And Wittgenstein, even though he was a prickly pear like Schopenhauer, an inspiration in his youth, he was not an entirely closed up or unloving guy. Neither was Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer loved poodles. Please see my talk on all of that. He could see the cosmos in the eyes of the poodles and in the eyes of each and every pet cat. And he had many cats, and I will pet them much after this. And yes, he gets a little bit of disgrace. So anywho's it's abstract ideas. Like Buddha and Aristotle, Confucius believes balance is essential. Very much Ma'at of Egypt also. What he calls the supreme middle way. Held earlier, which is what he thinks, and this is what the Han are promoting him for very much, Confucius argues in many, many ways, if you read between the lines and over of it, that he thinks the Zhou was a loving, wonderful time when emperors were loving and ancient sage kings and were good. Well, after the ancient, most famous of sage kings came the Zhou, far later for the Chinese folks, and dynasties. But that's why the Zhou was prosperous. We need to get back into balance. Then we will be peaceful and prosperous, and we'll get our empire together. And then the Han gets the empire together and promotes Confucianism. Confucius says nobody would leave the house without using the door. I gave a talk about the mean, and Confucius liking that. Please see that, especially with all of this. But people try to walk through life, Confucius says, without using the middle way between things. Confucius is equally famous for teaching cultivation. I already explained in the talks, Li is very much in Chinese culture. Education, tradition, cultivation, a very simple word, again, like Ren, love, which would mean something like the text, the culture, the tradition, the ways, the polite ways of society. A pervasive word which would mean somewhat like Bill O'Reilly says positively against the 60s, the establishment, of the culture, whether one is being cultural or, like the Taoists, going back into the nature and letting the hair grow down, countercultural. So, which isn't exactly progressive for the Taoists because they believe that's back to nature, like hippies. So, you have here Li, which includes rituals, tradition, religion, education, civilization, the ways that we learn to make distinctions. Very much what a conservative would be conservative over. Culture and the distinctions of culture. The better over the worse. Compassion is the common unity, Confucius says, in spite of certainly wanting to establish conservatively the better over the worse, that then includes everything and draws it all together. Balance with these, showing us the similarities beyond the differences, and tradition, education, and civilization teach us to separate the bad from the good, showing us the differences beyond the similarities. Confucius also spoke of determination, yi, again, determination, so many syllables, something like courage or strength, the courage and righteousness of duty, and discretion, which is more like something like wisdom or good judgment, shi, a good sense of judgment for right and wrong, as well as many other virtuous and terrible qualities we have. Now, Mencius, Menze, Master Men, who's also Latinized by the Jesuits, they did not like or Latinize Sunse. So Mensa, Mencius, Master Men, the second most important Confucian, to many, not all, took the four virtues of compassion, cultivation, determination, and discretion, Ren first and love first and foremost, and says these are the four chambers of the human heart, the Chinese and Egyptians before them clearly being familiar with human anatomy. Also known as sin, like, of course, it is in Christianity, sin is, of course, bad. The heart, X-I-N, H-S-I-N, sin, but it's sin, like where you're pausing before the S. As best as I can fake it, I don't claim that I can do it well at all. I try, though, a little. Sin is, and I just say heart thus, sin is equivalent to the mind. The heart is very much the mind. The Greeks sort of talk about the heart as if it's the mind. Ancient people do talk about heart, mind, your inner self, what you think, feel. Whether or not they place it in the head, heart, with the eyes, in the beating of the heart and the feelings. In the ancient world, they weren't so specific. And in fact, modern times, I like to point out, of course, is your consciousness here? Is it here? Is it in your stomach also? Is it here in this finger? Is it in your nerves? Where is it? We haven't really answered those questions entirely, but it is more common to think, and many philosophers do. Plato seems to have a totem pole up to the head and the eyes, very much, in spite of Aristotle, very much like the Chinese folks, seeming to talk more like it's in the balance of the heart, which is more kind of Egypt, the heart, the mind, all of that. I say, and in fact, that loose weirdness I just told you is kind of how I introduce people to Greek and Chinese thought. Yeah, the mind, the heart, brain, and then what that is, how they debated. As you kind of can. Of course, we would say your emotional brain is not in your heart. It is in your, say, limbic midbrain, but then where is the thought and why and stuff? Yes, I would say it's probably not physically in the heart, but lots of debates, lots of interesting stuff. Is this conscious? Hello, you. Sadite. Is this the nerves here? Are they conscious? I don't know. I've said that in front of classrooms. Watch everybody kind of stare and smile or look around. I don't know. But, I mean, again, I do also know a bunch of people haven't figured out where the heck the qualia is since I was in college. But that is, again, one way or the other. I am describing my eye roll, Cindy. Again, lol and OMG. So, with all of that, the Chinese definitely think that blood and energy runs as qi, again, confusingly spelled qi in the new system, but that this runs through the heart, sin. So you basically have, of course, energy, and of course I come from hippie land, yay. You would have in Indian and Chinese systems and Greek systems, Pythagoreanism, which is very much Neo-Pythagoreanism, is a lot of flower of life kind of New Age stuff. You would have equations and syncretism. Historically, a bunch. I will keep cats in view, as I do. Hey, buddy. Yes, I do feel they're quite pleasing to the eye and mind. Is that I find them so anyway, all the time. When the little Leo lion guy is not a roaring for some treats, which he does and is quite cute. For the third or fourth time, it's great. And when they see me setting up for a video, it's time to ask for treats, of course, because I can be so conditioned. I can be taught. That's right. What we have here is that what we can be taught, and back to the teachings of the ancients and the elders, is that energy runs through things. Feel the vibes, man. That runs through your heart and your mind, and that is the social and the community and the thinking and the feelings and how the mind and life work, which is not so crazy to think. Of course, people get very new agey about that, and I love how crazy that is to think and the history of all sorts of culture and counterculture. But through Mencius's fourfold system, he says the four chambers of the heart are Ren, Yi, Qi, and if I got that, where is this? I have all four of them here somewhere. Anywho's, it is love, growth, courage, and judgment. Discretion, sort of wise judgment. And he says those are the four chambers of the heart. Love is kind of the most base, I would say, it seems, would be the lower big chamber of the heart. It flowers upward out of the tree trunk, it would seem, would be implied. And so the heart has one major virtue, Ren, that then sprouts into three other virtues that out of love, and that is definitely what I see in the text, it definitely seems. Confucius is saying there's one core virtue, which is love, the lowest main part of the heart. But Mencius is then a second guy who's pushing this into kind of Confucius and saying this is how it is, so it's hard to say what exactly is Confucius after the fact. And how he was systematized. Remember, he isn't writing the Analects. Others are writing it about him and chunks of it that are not entirely organized according to theme at all, it would seem. So, and people go through them again and again, mixing and matching. It is confusing as to how they are organized at all. So, quite arguably. So you have Mencius imposing something like there's this system, but what you find as the overall point of what I am telling you with all of those confusions is love is the major thing of life, the central trunk of the mind and life and thought, love and perspective and wisdom and love, life, the lifeblood, what flows through your heart and connects you to others and all of that, however one wants to parse that. You then have other virtues that are ways of balancing, Republican dad gating, ways of using discretion and judgment and courage and distinguishing things. But what you find is that there is this inclusive, unitive love that then is counterbalanced by outgrowth. Something like a unitive trunk of a tree is in the heart, which looks like a tree trunk and looks like a bunch of branchings of one into many, which is a very simple and human way of organizing things. The oneness of love, and Confucius very much says that runs throughout the whole thing. The depth of the heart then branches outward into distinctions. So you have one love for humanity, one love, one heart, Dr. Bob. You then love humanity, and then beyond that, you develop out of the love and basic love of humanity and the unitive force. You can see the folk psychology and the kind of way this is the oneness in the king and this family and the self and the body, and then it branches out. I come before you as a mighty tree, that I am branching out myself. My heart branches out. My heart will again go on for a while here, and then the lecture will give out, let's hope, as my voice continuously does, trying to cram in the talks. So with all of this, you have one unitive virtue, which is inclusive love and wisdom, very Socrates, in fact, in many ways, as others have said long before I was alive. And then you have, out of that, you have branchings of distinctions and choppingness, and okay, I'm going to shadow and light this part of the deeper light, because I got to make distinctions and chop this and that out and push this bad person away and stuff. But even as you push the bad person away or keep the homeless locked out, you would have a deeper love and unity, which would be the guiding force and the whole reason for the whole thing. Because Confucius has a lot of brilliant teachings about how you don't make distinctions, you don't chop things up for the wrong reasons. I did read much later in my whole teachings and stuff and career of teaching work that actually has impressed me, which says, Zen is even very Confucian. And there are ways where actually you could read Confucius, and people have, again, before I was alive, even out here in California and the Americas in English, in the Anglophonics. Some sort of barbershop quartet. Now, with all of that, Confucius is weirdly very Zen, even though he is not often presented as that or thought of that in China much, or has been, is that he is actually saying, and this is all not as sharply divided in ways religiously as the Abrahamic world, forever, but there's been wars back and forth and factions within factions of stuff. In Chinese history a lot, with the support of power and not. Confucius is very strangely Zen, where he doesn't mind chopping up things or making a bunch of jerk-like judgments as long as, or acting the fool, as the Zen stuff is mentioned. Confucius also does act the fool, and who am I? And that's Socrates and Confucius both act like a Taoist and like a Zen master. They're all like, I'm just a simple country lawyer. I don't know anything. They definitely have at least an act of what could be false modesty, like that they definitely like acting the fool, acting lowly like water, like the Taoist. So weirdly enough, Confucius does sound kind of Zen and being like, who am I? I'm not perfect. He is very much Republican dad, conservative dude, about a lot of things in very much foundational ways. He also then weirdly says counterbalance all of that with inclusive love, and that's the outer, not the sort of real trunk and inner, which I think all kinds of people of all walks of politics and life can get along with and understand and learn from. I have found that in classrooms, talking to a whole classroom of people who are diverse and interested in different forms of politics, plenty and entirely. With as wide a spread of that in Berkeley as elsewhere, is that as almost anywhere in Berkeley classrooms. But because of that, saying Confucius to people does, even if, I have rarely that a student doesn't find Confucius interesting or useful for some kind of thing. Maybe that's the danger here, as Nietzsche says of thought. Or any perspective or love or wisdom at all. That'll just get you outdoors and lock up your daughters in love, as well as your emotions, I suppose. As I have joking recently, if a guy sang the song Poker Face, everybody would be like, yeah, Bill, move on with your life, somewhat. It's like men foolishly are supposed to have the poker face, so lock up your love and your daughters. So back on from my terrible jokes, and all of this, Confucius is, if he studies very hard, he could be a doctor or a lawyer, is very Confucian dad. And deep within, of course, what is it that gives all of this the meaning itself, the human heart and love? Otherwise, all of this is unjust and unjustified, which is powerful Zen, left-wing, right-wing, all sorts of stuff, as I chop this up foolishly with stupid jokes for you and try to keep you entertained. Hopefully you don't think I'm the worst person. I probably could not be. I'd have to get up earlier in the morning. So, the inclusive compassion is the lowliest and largest part of the heart, and distinguishing cultivation, determination, and discretion sprout outward as channeling valves, which you'd physically see, from one into many, into the branchings of the body in our social lives. And yes, I think it is. Ancient people have most definitely just looked at brute reality as far as they could see it without microscopes, and that is, as you find in India, Greece, and China, and I love that kind of pragmatic, embodied mind thinking. Are they looking at temples? Are they looking at human hearts? Well, then they talk about temples and balance in human hearts, wouldn't they, with blocks of stone and ventricles? Yes, they would. You can see it. So they'd have the deepest thought about how to balance stone and how to have blood running through the heart. Yes, indeedy, they would. And they would think that's the stars, that's the heart, that's the mind, that's society. Good night, everybody. They would clearly in the ancient world have less specialization by necessity and have fewer texts and simply try to learn what we can about balance in society from obvious metaphors that still we love and are useful about blocks of stone in triangles in the desert for the Egyptians and balance in the plumb bob of the human heart and society and perspective. Again, I do love teaching this stuff for just these sorts of reasons. It is wonderful human stuff, and that is whether or not you like anything going on in the world or not, or anybody today. I'm sure we all need to, and I do with my jokes, use more determination, a little bit less though, and plenty of discretion. So we must have loved to see the larger picture, as well as the culture, courage, and judgment to choose this over that, such as this perspective over that perspective. So in that sense, very much like a liberal, Confucius would want you to open up the heart, and love progressively goes outward. But unlike a Moist, Mo-tzu gets very upset with the Confucians, want something more like radical, open-ended communism, and the Taoists want something more like hippie nature. Confucius very much stands against the hippie Taoists and against the more communist Moists. I pleasantly and loosely say, because they're not entirely communists, it gets interesting. They're more into spirits, Mo-tzu thinks, than Confucius, which makes them weirdly not so communist, but Confucius does not think being a hippie in nature or being in a commune with the more not so hippie but rather utilitarian communist Moists, he would not have thought any of that was improper. He probably would not know. If you had told Confucius Taoism and Moist, of course he'd like, what is this weird English language both of us are speaking? But he also would not know what a Taoist or a Moist necessarily is in his day. But in his day, he would know thinkers who are going to become that, and he would say, no, as well as other things. You make the right, responsible, objective, proper societal decisions, most conservatively. You don't just fall out into love and love nature and hug the bears yes, in the documentary. Or you go, you don't then just form the hippie commune. And again, as I often joke here in Berkeley town over the Onion piece, it's like hippie commune ruined by nice woolen blanket, which of course people, laugh at, because of course we're all human beings. It's like, that's a nice woolen blanket, and then, yes, tussle fight of hippies. So obviously joking around with all of these perspectives in life and everything, and I do take license to joke about hippies a lot. I did grow up with a teepee in a neighboring backyard. In the 80s, children. And I've seen white people wear Native American headgear before. So, back in the day, usually without a shirt. So I don't do that. I get sunburned easily. And with all of that, I should use more discretion and tell you much love. I should just sign off, of course, right here, and will. And we're going to go on after this first talk about Confucius, which I knew I can lengthen out into several about Confucius alone, but I will about the Confucians and Confucian thought we are centrally spending some time on. As we talk about having to see the larger picture as well as love and culture and judgment and choosing this side over that wisely for ourselves as well as that's what everyone's doing, I will move on into the next talk soon about comparing ourselves to others to master ourselves, which is basically using everything I just went on about the four chambers of the heart and Mencius is going to then superimpose into Confucius a bit, as far as modern scholars, Chinese and global think, which is different from what scholars previously thought in China and elsewhere, that we will then use that basis of what I've been talking about to then go on into what is the master person, noble man, the noble for Confucius, and how does this person learn to use perspective to balance and chop life up wisely. Which is a bit like Nietzsche's Übermensch, although his is quite much more libertarian anarchistic. So that said, hopefully that is good for your life and others. And as always, I will follow this with other talks, and I will see you if and when I ever see you.